Hi Year 12. Today I'm going to take you through some ideas that you can use for your investigation, building on the sort of overview video that you should have watched for last lesson. So today is very much focused on me giving you more ideas or routes into it and helping you to come up with a good plan. And I'm also going to go through how to frame your question as well, because it's very precise. There's little rules governing it. I do think that how to frame your question is really, really important as well for when you're at university and you're doing your dissertation. It takes a long time to pin down your question, and the university tutors will go to town on making sure your question is well worded before you get started. So it's a really good chance to practice that and prepare for it if you're planning to go to university. Just to give you an idea of where we're heading next week, as well as giving you feedback on your latest child language work and doing a final quiz on that, I'm going to teach you how to make your experiment fair and how to write up your introduction and methodology, because I would like you to have done that before you collect any data, so we can make sure that your approach is right and you're not going to waste any of your time. The other thing I wanted to say was, please pause this video. I'm going to go through different options and different ideas, and hopefully, you don't have to pick something off this PowerPoint, but hopefully something that I say might trigger a creative train of thought in your brain just to think, oh, maybe something like that. And then, so what I'm saying is, give yourself time to let your brain digest the thoughts and take them in your own direction and think, well, what element of that would interest me, or what's similar to that, what does that make me think of? So pause regularly and see where your brain takes you, and hopefully something I say will just inspire a chain of thought and you'll end up with something that you really want to do. Okay, let's get started then. So firstly, I just want to stress that obviously, given the current context, and as I said in the last video, we are limited by what data you can get your hands on from a lockdown setting, and also theorists as well for representations investigations. We study representations from a very clinical approach, really. We look at the AO1 and we look at the AO3, and you don't look at AO2, so we don't analyse any theorists who kind of have researched how different elements of society are represented in the media. So if you choose to do a representation study, which many people do because they're really varied and they're really interesting, and a lot of people care about how things are represented in the media, you can, absolutely, but you are going to need to commit to doing a bit of research on whatever you're focusing on, on whatever you're analysing. So if you're analysing representation of women in the media, you will have to Google on Google Scholar and find some theorists to back you up who have, or to discuss, who have researched how women are represented in the media. They absolutely are out there. This is not difficult. It's just that you can't just go back to your folder and find it, or use your brain and think of other theorists that you've already been taught, because you haven't been taught any. Okay. Right, so child language then. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to come up one more. Your primary sources then. This is sort of, I'm using primary sources in this definition as being sources that you could create or actively get your hands on by collating together. So it's not necessarily something that already exists in the world. You'd need to record it or ask somebody else to. So the first one, could you get audio clips of fathers and mothers speaking to their children? Could you compare whether there's a difference in the way they speak to their child? Remember, we had one theorist that suggested there was, but it was quite limited. So that's something that you could develop and look if that is the case. Could you maybe compare how one parent speaks differently to a male and female child? Now, that would be tricky in terms of very few parents have children of different genders of the same age, and obviously the variation there would be, well, they may be speaking differently to the boy because he's a year older than the girl, for example. So that could be a tricky one, but it's something you might want to look at and consider consider controlling. Third one, can you get evidence of any students writing? because that could still mean that you could look at that. And you did loads of work with Sir on that could be applied. So could you compare writing undertaken in the classroom before lockdown with writing completed during the lockdown? Has there been a marked difference? Is the absence of a teacher in the room with them making their writing worse or better? That again, you'd have to consider how much input parents had into homeschooling, etc. And of course, if you could even get your hands on that data in the first place. Could you maybe investigate whether children with parents who've gone to university have a wider vocabulary or grammatical system than those who haven't? That would just require you getting audio clips of children who, from various households where like half have parents who've gone to university and half haven't. You'd obviously have to make sure the clips are a similar length, etc., and a similar context. But that's definitely a feasible study if you know enough children who that would apply to. But remember, again, you'd have to have them in a similar age bracket, otherwise it wouldn't be comparable. Okay, so let's imagine you don't know any children in the world and you're having to rely on secondary sources. YouTube, as we said in the last video, is a really good resource if you can find something on there. Obviously, you can't just blindly look on YouTube for children speaking. You'd have to think of something that you're interested in studying that you could find data for on YouTube. Could you have a look at how children's language develops on a TV show? Stewie from Family Guy came to my mind straight away because he's my favourite character, he's really funny. And the humour is created because he speaks like an adult, so that might be quite interesting to look at. Maybe how our expectations of how children speak is used to create humour. That's a really quite a tricky approach. But you could maybe compare him, 3 different children in 3 different TV shows. You might have a look at one child who was maybe in a soap. I don't watch soaps, so I can't think of any examples, but someone who was born on the TV show and then has grown up on the TV show, and you could get clips of them speaking over the years and have a look if it tracks with different child language theorists and ways you can analyse and explore that language that the child used. That might be an interesting one. Does the child's language on a set of films or a TV show? So I suppose that's quite similar, to be fair, but I've just added films in. It doesn't have to be a TV show. That comes back to YouTube. Like a lot of parents are kind of putting up videos of their children on YouTube now, so it could be quite interesting to see, biggest child YouTube stars, if there's a similarity in their language. You might even be able to bring accent and dialect in there as well. I wonder if they all have a sort of, come from a certain region, or they put on a voice to fit in with the rest of the YouTube crowd. Can you find any transcripts of feral children? That might be interesting if you can actually find, maybe children who've not had a primary caregiver or who've had to give evidence in court, something like that, where it could be interesting to study their language, how adult it is. That could be interesting. You might, it's quite difficult, but even, children who've been raised by grandparents compared to parents might be interesting. I don't know. This is an interesting one. Also consider books where children speak. So hopefully you got something on your bookcase that could work. So I thought of Room by Emma Donoghue. I don't know if you've seen the film with I've forgotten her name, Brie Larson. So that's written from the perspective of the young boy. Is his name Jacob, I think. So you could compare that to another text, but you could just evaluate that story that this author's written from the perspective as a young boy. And I think what makes it quite an interesting book is that he has had limited contexts because he's been raised in this one room because his mum was kidnapped. So he was born in the room and he lived in the room till he was about 7, 8. And then after that, in the book, you don't see as much in the film, but in the book, it describes a lot about him being in hospital afterwards and how he's been looked after. So it's quite an interesting one to pick apart for the realism of it, and how he, in the book, was limited by the fact that, he wasn't going outside and seeing all these different things and meeting all these different people. He literally just spoke to his mum for the first 7 years or 8 years of his life. Okay. So language and gender, again, I think, well, You're the first year at Hilders that we've been able to allow to do child language development as your investigation, because usually we don't do it till year 13. So usually language and gender and representations, which I'll go through next, are the sort of most popular options. So for language and gender primary sources, you could, like we said in the video yesterday, investigate a male adult Zoom call with a female adult to see if there's a difference between their language used. Remember, if you're investigating language and gender that you've done with Miss Carney, you are looking to see if there are differences between the language used by males and females in different contexts. Could you investigate how boys speak to each other on WhatsApp during the lockdown compared to how girls speak to each other? That might be quite an interesting application of Tannen in terms of, you know, are people speaking to compromise or build relationships, show emotions, or are people sort of enhancing their own status? That could be quite interesting. Could you analyse 2 female teachers' remote learning instructions compared to 2 males? Again, remember that Mr. Rose said yesterday that this is just really a current take on what a lot of students do. So they, you know, comparing the language used in the classroom is like a typical investigation. It's not very original. But maybe perhaps looking at it in terms of remote learning instructions could be quite interesting. If you did a video, you would have to transcribe it. If you did instructions, it's already written down, so just bear that in mind. Could you investigate whether there's whether there's language differences in teenagers or younger children of different genders? We talked about that a bit yesterday as well in terms of what if there is a gender gap in people's language. Well, when does that emerge? How much is society shaping our young children to speak in a certain way? And maybe just, you know, thinking, does context matter? So as we've moved forward in language studies with regards to gender, it's very much become, it's not that men and women are different, it's just the different contexts that they find themselves in. So, you know, that's a starting point. You might want to pause here and think about that and think if there's anything that interests you there. And then I was just thinking about something that you could ask for. Now remember, if you've had to request somebody to record something, then it's not really natural, so it's a limitation. However, that might be something that you could look at and ask commissioning data almost. So asking people to send you them speaking about themselves on a video for 1 minute, people of different genders, for example, or, you know, written pieces that you could pick apart and analyze. So there's something in that if you wanted to look at language and gender. Your secondary sources then, obviously again, you've got TV, so language used by people of different genders on TV. You would need to control the variables a lot. I don't know why there's a question mark there, because it's just a fact. It's just a declarative. So that's obviously, it depends what you're interested in there, but you've got a massive scope there of data that you could use. Maybe you can investigate written language used by males and females in the same context. So for example, letters to MPs or posts on a discussion board. It is interesting, I think. I'm in a Harry Potter Facebook group, and I've used it I used it quite a lot with last year. I don't think I used it that much with you because it was very interesting. Obviously everyone's united by the fact that they love Harry Potter, but it was people from all around the world, and we ended up sometimes like people were discussing racial issues and getting offended by language, and it's a really strange world of sort of, it's almost like a social experiment sometimes looking at how people communicate in there. So if you're part of a discussion board or a niche group, then you've got a really good opportunity to sort of gather data about how language is used. Even just taking it back to how language is used online, how people speak to each other online compared to in real life, maybe. Obviously, we you know, a lot of the theorists talk about males and females and differences, but we try not to see gender as such a binary thing anymore. So you could look at maybe an investigation that explores that. How do our theories apply across a broad spectrum of genders? You know, maybe there's something in looking at Caitlyn Jenner's language, and whether it changed or not even just that, just in terms of use across, you might be able to find a range on YouTube of kind of different clips, or something that you're particularly interested in that area. in anything that's already been published, you can investigate the language used by males and females. So just be careful you don't fall into analysing how they're represented. So in a book, you wouldn't be analysing the representation of the female and what the female is portrayed as being. Is she a stereotype? You'd be looking at the language used by the female in her dialogue. Does she speak differently to males and females? You might look at this in children's books, because that would be interesting to see if children are being taught these gender divides at an early age because of what's written in children's books or on children's TV shows, or even, you know, teenage young adults as well. Oh, I really like that one. I think I'll do that one. House of Parliament, there's been plenty of coverage. In fact, yesterday, Rebecca Long-Bailey who is a female, is up against the Education Secretary, who is male. So that could be interesting, because it's the same conversation, same day, it's the same topic. It was about teachers and schools opening. You could look at the language used between them two. Okay, representations then. As I said before, you must realise that if you want to pick representations, and lots of people do because it's really interesting and there's loads you can do with it, you will need to research some theory. And obviously I will guide you through that. Google Scholar is always the answer, but I'll guide you through it when we come to it. Please don't worry. I will not let you submit an investigation that has no theorists, because it will hinder your mark too much. All right, so this is not an exhaustive list. There is so much you can do with representations, but this is just everything I could think of this morning on this dull Friday morning. So you could look at the representation of Brexit in the media, and maybe even how that's changed, or in different, like, left versus right, or pro-Brexit versus anti-Brexit press releases or parties, campaigns. You might look at the actual campaigns themselves and the language they use, the 350 million for the NHS slogan versus the anti-Brexit slogan, things like that. So there's loads of scope there. Coronavirus in the media, if you want to kind of linger on it anymore, and you know, remember I said yesterday, think carefully about whether you want to spend a long time investigating this and thinking about it. You can compare different outlets. I think it's very interesting the way this sort of war lexis has risen in terms of frontline workers, and, you know, all this kind of feeling around it being very similar to fighting in a war zone, that people on Twitter like to highlight is ridiculous. So there's something in that, I think, in terms of how the virus is being represented. You could compare to internationally. So you might even look at the representation of the British government in a British newspaper compared to an international newspaper. You can get your hands on those now. The Guardian keeps quoting other newspapers from around the world as well. Those who are against lockdown on Twitter. So I'm just giving you different ideas, like even like using Twitter as a rich source of data. The difficulty is being fair in how you select the data, because obviously there's like billions of tweets sent, if not every day, very regularly. So anything really that's being discussed on Twitter, you can have a look at the representation of from different outlets, maybe even different celebrities or people with a tick next to their name who have got kind of authority. That could be one way of siphoning out the tweets that you use. Oops, sorry. It doesn't have to be those against lockdown. It could be anything. Females in magazines, best-selling films or politics. So that was quite a good one for. We had that last year. Somebody looked at the representation of males and females in fitness magazines, and females, it was all about slim, slender, fit, and then males was about bulky, strength. So that was a really interesting investigation. It brought up a lot of obvious things. You know, what are the top 10 best-selling films of last year? How many of them represent females in a positive light or is equal to men? How many of them even starred females? Remember, you need to look at the language used within the films to describe the females. You're not looking at like a sociological point of view in terms of, oh, women in this film are represented as weak or blah blah. You know, there's only one female actor. You need to be looking at the language used within the script to describe the males and females. Females in politics as well is an interesting one, and Diane Abbott is very famously kind of targeted and victimized on Twitter. For various reasons, but one of them is very much like there's a lot of, seems to be a trend about women in politics and how much the language used to describe them online is quite vindictive compared to men. Jeremy Corbyn's representation in the right-wing press compared to the left, or you might compare Jeremy Corbyn's representation to Keir Starmer, the new Labour leader who's just taken over. He certainly seems to be getting a much more positive press. You'd have to be interested in that, but it might throw up some interesting things. Maybe you might want to look at a specific racial group in the media, but in a specific media outlet like the Daily Mail or the Guardian or whatever, on Channel 4 News, whatever you wanted. Teenagers in young adult fiction, so you might select one or two young fiction extracts and have a look at how teenagers are represented there. Maybe even look at comparing it to adult books or in TV shows, which I think I've put next yet. In the news as well is an interesting one. They tend to always have, poor showing in the news, not really given much time for positive stories, films, TV. Other ideas, last slide. NHS workers and how our representation of those has changed over time in a specific publication. I think that would be quite interesting, especially in light of recent, obviously they're doing a fantastic job right now, and everybody in the media is very much celebrating them, but that wasn't always the case. And, they've had pay cuts after pay cuts in the last 10 years. How have different media outlets maybe changed the representation of NHS workers? That could be worth looking at. Teachers as well, same as above. I don't know if you've seen the front page of the Daily Mail today, but definitely, I have no words. Boris Johnson, again, how's the representation of him changed in recent times, given obviously, before he was elected, after his election, and now during this crisis, when he was even smaller than that compared to when he was in hospital, then to when he was out or before he went in. You'd have to pick the same publication though. Muslim terrorists versus white terrorists is an interesting one, because white terrorists are very rarely referred to as white terrorists. They're usually referred to as just murderers or gunmen, or gunwomen, although it is usually men. That might be something else you want to investigate. Scousers in the media or on popular television, that could be one to investigate. Have a look at how they're spoken about, language used to describe them. And maybe even other countries as well. So the language used to describe South Korea or China compared to the US. Language used to compare in the media to describe Trump in different outlets. Remember, you have access to an awful lot of American media, so that they're good sources of data. Meghan Markle might be an interesting one, looking at, the Daily Mail is quite well known for having targeted her quite a lot with negative articles. You might want to trace how that changed before and after her move to Canada. Again, you'd have to pick a specific publication. Okay, other options, if none of that really particularly interests you, obviously you've got the other elements that you've done with Miss Carney over the year. So you've got language and occupation. Again, you might be able to link that to some Zoom calling at home. Or, you might watch, does Casualty still exist? Holby City? I don't know. A TV show where people are in their occupations might be interesting. Language and sexuality, as we discussed on the last video. Language in different social groups, language and location, so accents, dialects, etc. Local, regional variations in language. So there's quite a lot, you've got so many options. It's just about you taking the time now to have a think about what really appeals to you. The other thing I just want to go through in this video is how to frame your question. Now, this is really important. And again, I'm teaching you for uni as well as your A-level here. So please write this down. So these are the rules for how you need to frame your question. Now, obviously, once you've decided what you want to do, this is going to be your first step, and you're going to send me a question, and I'm going to okay your question before you do anything else. So it's important that you apply these rules. So firstly, rule number 1, it must start with to what extent, because you are evaluating. It will lead you to weigh up the extent. So it's the same as what we do with our child language essays. You've got to look for pros and cons against your own statement, your own question. Sorry, not statement. It's very important that it's a question. So don't start with a comparison of, or investigation into, or an exploration of. You must start with, to what extent does language used by blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, does language used by might not be in your question. It depends what your question is. But those 3 words must start your question. Please don't send me a question that doesn't start with those 3 words. It's just essential. Okay, rule number 2. It needs to not include a specific theorist. So it is not okay to say, to what extent is Tannen's theory reflected in workplace Zoom meetings? That is too narrow. It's going to limit your study, and you won't get any marks for applying relevant range of theorists, because you will only be looking at one theorist. You will really limit your study. No, 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 no. So it would be better to say, to what extent does language differ between different genders during workplace Zoom meetings? And then you will apply your language theorists when you're, your gender theorists when you're analysing your investigation and your data, but you will not explicitly state that in your question, because you're just going to narrow yourself. So you're just looking at how language differs between different genders. Now, the word genders indicates you're going to be looking at gender theorists, but why pigeonhole yourself? Maybe when you get this data in, you actually see some really interesting occupational elements of it, or age elements of it, or I don't know, politeness, Grice's maxims and all that sort of elements. So please don't limit yourself in your question. I've highlighted in bold language differ because it's a very good phrase to use, especially if you're comparing. To what extent does language differ is a really good sentence stem for you to use in your questions. Okay, rule number 3, it needs to be precise. So although you need to be broad with your theories and not pin yourself down, you do need to be precise about what specifically you're investigating. You only have 15,000 words. This is not a 10-year scientific study, so you need to really pin it down. So don't say, for example, to what extent are women represented equally in the media? Because the media is huge. It's worldwide, it's massive, so you can't, it needs to be more precise than that. So for example, to what extent are women represented positively in the Daily Mail? And I feel like positively is a bit more precise than equally as well. And you've chosen one specific publication, and that's what you're going to put in your question, so that the examiner knows and I knows what the focus of your investigation is supposed to be. Okay, rule 4. As I've said already, if you're comparing, you need to use the word differ. So don't say, to what extent can we compare the language? Of course you can compare the language. Everybody can compare anything. What you need to say instead is, to what extent does the language used by children of different genders differ? So you're specifically pinning down, do you looking at to what extent language differs and in who? Okay, so a lot of you will choose comparison investigation, so make sure you use that as an example. Oh, this should be rule 5, I apologize. If you're looking at representations, you need to use the word representations in your question, and you also need to specify a time frame on a publication really as well, should have said. So for example, to what extent are NHS workers treated fairly in the Daily Mail? Well, you've not included the word representation there, and also there's not a specific time frame. So better would be to say, to what extent has the representation of NHS workers changed in the Daily Mail in the last year? Now, another reason why that's better is because treated fairly, again, is limiting your scope of analysis, because you're only looking for fair treatment. And what does that even mean? It's very subjective who decides what's fair and what isn't. Instead, by using the word representation, and you're being nice and open, you're going to have a look, just going to take a look at how the workers are represented and in what way they're portrayed, and then you're going to apply your contextual knowledge to kind of draw conclusions about that. So that's a really nice example, that last one, of how to phrase a good question. All right, final thought. I will just say on questions, actually, before I say that, your question can be tweaked. You don't feel like you can never change it. If your data leads you in a different direction, that's fine, we will tweak it. But obviously I do need to make sure that you're following these rules initially, because everything you do from your question onwards needs to be driven by your question. And otherwise you're going to end up with a very loose, waffly investigation, and you just won't get those higher marks. Part of this is about being methodical and practical and fair and consistent. This is an experiment. You've got to be restrained. You can't just throw everything up in the air and see what falls down, even though some of us would prefer to work that way, including me. All right, so you do need to pick something that interests you, obviously, and I just think it's just such a it's a sad waste if you don't, because it's such a great opportunity. I'd love to do a study every week. I just think it's so interesting. So look around you at the world. Look at how language is being used. What's timely? What's important? What do you really care about? What matters to you or to our society? What do you want to change about language? Pick something that you kind of, that bothers you in everyday conversation. You might even look at how spag errors in corporate workplaces like Tesco, which doesn't have an apostrophe in women's. I don't know if there's anything in that. I just like to moan about it. What are you interested in exposing? Well, the fact that Tesco doesn't know how to use apostrophes. Now, remember as well, this study can make you unique. So when you're writing your personal statements in September, October for uni, or if you have to go to university interviews, this is a great chance for you to show that you can take initiative, that you have an interest in the world, in how language is being used in the world, that you conduct your own study, and you're socially aware of what's going on. Now, it doesn't matter if you're not going to do a degree that's related to English language. These are skills that every university course will want you to have, and workplace as well. It just shows you've got really good initiative and understanding of the world around you. Okay, so I've gone over today then ideas for your investigation and how to frame your question. You should have the notes on number 2. Next week, as I said, we're going to look at making your experiment fair and your introduction methodology. And I'm hoping that we can be ready after half term to start collecting data if we've got your question finalised and your methodology finalised. Now, I'm not sure how optimistic that is, we'll have to see, but certainly having your question finalised by after half term so that you can be working on your methodology and introduction would be ideal. So I'm giving you a good 2 weeks before you need to have a final decision on your investigation. Let it linger away in the back of your mind, give yourself some time to think about it. You might change your mind in that time, so make sure you jot down any ideas you've got and keep coming back to them when you have them. Carry a little notebook around with you. Or don't, it's up to you. Okay, I hope you have fun with it. And as always, let me know if you have any questions, and you can contact me on Teams or you can contact me by email. Thanks, guys.